Well, everyone, I have been looking forward to speaking with Mr. Raymond K, Hessel, or Owen for a very, very long time. Owen's YouTube channel is tremendous. He explores books that a lot of people ignore. He brings thoughts that I think are utterly critical and paramount that are not discussed elsewhere. I think he's a very close reader of text, but not someone who, say, is unable to think about the implications of the text for the world today. You know, it's one thing to be able to read closely and then talk about what the text means, and that's extremely important, but then it's an entirely another skill to see that close reading in the context of the world that we are now in. He's inspired so many different papers. Like he has this great one where he talks about the gymnasium, the Guardian class in Plato's Republic, and I'd never thought about that before, which was tremendous. His work on Fukuyama is tremendous. A lot of people, when they talk about Fukuyama, will talk about the end of history, but Owen here has done such great work on the biogenetic engineering that Fukuyama writes on that I think is fantastic. He also recently had a video on one of my favorites, Mr. Philip Rieff, Triumph of the Therapeutic. Owen has also put out two books recently. One, Notes from a Pod, which was outstanding, and then Studies on Thymos, which I'm halfway through Studies on Thymos and just think it's fantastic. And it's a real laser focus analysis on a concept that was so central to some classical thinking, and then the West proceeded to completely forget it. Funny how that works, and how bringing that back seems really, really important. Today, we're going to focus a lot on Notes from a Pod, but I will note that Notes from a Pod feeds so well into the question of Thymos, into his entire YouTube channel. So I'm just really happy to have Owen here today. And I love his name, Raymond from Fight Club. That's such a great scene out of the movie Fight Club. So I really like that. That sums up so much. So Owen, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As I was saying before, your channel has been a really good place for me to investigate different independent thinkers. So it's really been it's an opportunity for me to actually be part of that now. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Raymond. Now, Raymond, so that means a lot. And Raymond, if I were to come up to you on the street and it would say, "Oh, Notes from a Pod, what's that about and why should I care?" How would you respond to this random person on the street?
Okay, it's a good general vague question. So start there. Okay. I would say it's an exploration into if what we could use in jargon, kind of spatial ontological shift in how we communicate, live, and relate to, I would say, the external world in the sense of the elements, nature, but also social relations. I think I focus a little bit more on the external world and nature and pain and these kind of things things that cause us pain from the external world rather than social relations. But we could include all of that. I would say it's an investigation. It's a kind of critical investigation into what, to quote maybe Paul Virilio, the end of history, also being the end of geography in the sense that we become displaced and our sense of place gets obscured. And because we can communicate instantly and the ability to kind of virtualize a surrounding and an exterior is very much the kind of power, technological power, and the gift that we've been given through these kind of digital era technology. So it's a critical investigation into that relationship with also some theories and ideas of how we can maybe build a more authentic relationship to the external kind of world, if we can put it like that. Yeah.
Well, I really like this notion of kind of the death of distance, because it's interesting in the opening section where you discuss Plato's cave, there's an idea that classically you at least had a sort of spatial separation between inside the cave and outside the cave, but that requires kind of distance to exist. And what's funny is when distance dies, there's two ways it can go. You can say, okay, if there's no distance, maybe we're all outside the cave forever, or we're all inside the cave forever, but you no longer have the spatial separation by which to tell that you're inside or outside. So the distance, so inside and outside become two sides of the same coin. And I think sometimes we like to think when that occurs that the positive end of that will necessarily emerge. We'll all be outside the cave, and maybe that was kind of the promise of the Enlightenment or different things. But actually, no, once you kill distance, instead of us all being outside the cave, we're actually seemingly all inside the cave. And I really like how you describe and I'll hand it back to you on this kind of notion of Plato's cave as almost like the iPod, something we carry around. Man, they don't even call it an iPod anymore, do you see? That's how old I am. I remember when they had like the iPod or different things. So it's like a pod that you're carrying around, that you're in, and that you cannot escape. So I just found that a really fascinating chapter.
Yeah, I think exactly this is the point of like the Enlightenment, and I think the example I use in terms of trying to place and spatially contextualize illusion versus reality was the church versus state dichotomy, or fact value could also be another one. But these enlightened projects to politically and epistemically put kind of dangerous interpretive illusion, which there's a difficult task or an impossible task maybe of coming to a consensus, or kind of rational consensus, and then you have fact where there's an objective, a kind of enlightened rational objective grounding, we could say. And I think what you see happening is the disintegration of that simplistic split. I think you see this in a lot of different ways. I suppose the example I give is the sort of mobility of the cave, the ability to carry around our illusions. And I suppose this is a kind of point about globalization, which I thought about at the very start of writing this book, which was that it was because of the lockdowns. It was because we were all so static. We were just sitting in like one place, but the world was moving around us in the sense of through images, right? So you have this kind of realization about globalization. It's not so much about the movement of people so much, even though people do move, but it's more so about the movement of information. I think that's what globalization is actually. It's money and information as money, or money as information and images. And I suppose this stimulation of emotion and imagery through these kind of mass communicative infrastructures was very much making our, if I want something, I don't have to move for it. I can order it. If I want to see something, I can Google it. There's this kind of immobilization of the human subject, which comes as a consequence of the mobilization of information. We could put it that, yeah.
Well, that's fascinating, because it makes me think, it's almost like now you have no choice to kind of be in the cave of a socioeconomic system or information. Like anywhere I go in America, I'm within capitalism, right? Anywhere I go in America, I'm within the potential of, say, using the internet or being thought about in the internet. So there's this interesting way in which you cannot escape. Even if you're not using the internet, the very knowledge that the internet exists then defines you as someone currently not using the internet. Like if you're saying if you don't have a channel on YouTube, then you're someone who doesn't have a channel on YouTube. It's very interesting to think how the development of technology changes. I kind of want to say the term we use in a paper called Representing Beauty is tortness. Like once a camera is invented, you can now look at a tree and say, oh, I could take a picture of that. Before the camera, it's not possible to think of the tree as a potential photograph. But once the camera is invented, it is now a potential photograph. And this can actually create a certain anxiety, because you're like, why don't I take a picture of that? Don't I care about it? And the participation in using the technology becomes an affirmation that you actually care about the thing. And then in a funny way, I think we see this like at parties, where people are almost more concerned with taking pictures of being at the party than enjoying the party, because it's a kind of validation of the party. If we're not taking pictures of the party, it means we don't value it, or we're missing out, or we're letting something go. So there's this weird kind of nervousness that exists when one is at the party, and that gets in the way of actually enjoying the party, of which contributes to a kind of isolationism while at the party, because if everyone's taking pictures or tweeting or Instagramming in order to create a kind of, one is a kind of currency, because you're creating a kind of social currency of being at the party, and it's a kind of validation of the value of the party. For the organizers, they go online and say, oh, look, people took pictures, they must have had a good time. And yet the party in a way is inhibited or destroyed by the very necessity of people to turn it into currency or to validate it. And so in the very validation of the structure, there becomes a loss of the substance of which one is trying to validate. And we are all now stuck, because of these inventions, within a prison of which we have to think of things in those terms. And we can't get outside of that cave, unless you truly are off the grid, like you're really, really, truly off the grid. But then that's really difficult, because, say after, the Pilgrims could get in some boats and go across the ocean and go to some different place. They could escape Europe. It's kind of hard to imagine that level of exodus without, say, going to Mars. So there's this way in which now, because of the vastness of technology, the invention of all of these potentials, that we cannot help but define or think about ourselves in terms of these technological potentials. And then the question becomes, and I'll give it back to you, how we respond to that situation, how we emotionally come to terms with that situation, or if we just stop thinking about it and participate in it, precisely to kind of become more at home in that infinite way of kind of breaking up the world today into photographs and tweets, of which we, the moment we're here, we can think about our life in those terms.
Yeah, I think what you're describing there with the party, we're more interested in taking pictures, is that we're kind of temporally displaced as well as geographically, spatially displaced, because we're thinking about not the moment, we're thinking about how we're going to represent this moment within this social currency later on, like tomorrow or something. So we're kind of generally displaced by everything that's going on technologically right now. And I think very much an investigation into that displacement is very important. How we respond to it, I suppose, is an entire different question. I think at the very least for now, we can at least agree maybe that some sort of new style of awareness needs to be crafted in response to this kind of, not just like the social and the economic issues or the psychological issues, but deeply how this all relates to this kind of ontological displacement that we're talking about. Actually, just to explain further, there's another work which I hadn't read yet until I'd finished this, but I realized how kind of retroactively influential it was Peter Sloterdijk's work, Bubbles, and he's got his trilogy Spheres, and I've just started the first one. And it's quite a unique book. And he says at the beginning, and there's this kind of, he calls it a heliocentric crisis of when we realized that the Earth wasn't going around this my physics is really bad. The Earth wasn't going around the sun. The sun was the sun was actually going, no, the other way around, whatever. we made a mistake is what I'm trying to say, right? So after this mistake, it was like there was this crisis of like we no longer had a shell. We no longer kind of had a sense of ontological placement in our sense of being, and we were looking. This is kind of, to put it in very kind of Heideggerian terms, and we were looking out into the void of kind of just infinite space. Before there was the kind of, he also has this kind of Nietzschean death of God interpretation into this spatial kind of ontology too, where, you know, the death of God is a crisis in the heavenly realms are no longer there, and we're just looking out to the void. Once we're looking out to the void, I think we're starting to then try to restructure and rebuild a protective layer. And I think this is perhaps one way of looking at communication, and like, you know, when we're looking at you know, spheres, social spheres, spheres of influence, networks, and so on, that there's a sort of it's this kind of attempt to rebuild this this kind of protective shelling, and this protective shelling has unfortunately just been totally virtual. So it's kind of come with another crisis. It's kind of created a crisis on top of the crisis, if that makes sense. Yeah.
No, that's excellent, because there is definitely a way where when you're taking, you know, if you're at a party to create pictures of it, there's a kind of protection from the party, because you're, you know, it's kind of distanced from you. It's this weird way, because things are so paradoxical, where the death of distance has then resulted in us internalizing practices that make everything kind of fake. So in a way, making them distance. When you lose external distance, it actually gets manifest in internal distance creating. So you're distant from the party because it's just a tweet. It's just an Instagram thing. And you see, that creates a kind of shell, S-H-E-E-L, because then you can't encounter it and get kind of woken up or something challenged or something called out of you because you run into a real person. You know, it's almost like you have Plato's cave, and this time the prisoners are creating the pictures on the wall. Like, imagine they had a little device that controlled the pictures, and like they are generating their own pictures that are making the prisoners. Like, we've totally internalized it. And it's funny because it makes me think of that section in your book where you talk about touch, which, by the way, your analysis on Aristotle's take on touch is excellent, and it needs to be more widespread. I don't think that's appreciated. And where for Aristotle, you know, touch becomes this ability to identify reality, right? It's more of a, not just a mere sense, but it orders like, oh, this is real, this is actually there. Well, the thing is, the moment you touch something and it's real, oh, you can't just pretend like it's not there. It's actually in your world, and therefore it has a kind of call to you. How will you respond? And you talk about in the, I believe it's the circuit section, where you talk about Blade Runner, great analysis on, you know, the fact that you have this girlfriend, Ryan Gosling had this girlfriend, he can see here, but he can't touch. So in a sense, he's not real. You're denied touch, right? And how there's this kind of loss of reality. But the funny thing is, human beings almost seem to not want reality too much, because if they did, if they could touch it and say, this is real, then they'd have to respond to it. They'd have to relate to it. And then to touch on later in the book where you talk on Thymos, we don't have the thematic resources by which to handle reality, because reality is not something that is merely rational, merely, you know, eros, rational, thymos, I believe is the triad you were talking about in your book, the three parts of the soul. Well, we no longer have the thymotic resources by which to handle reality. So we almost don't want to be able to touch things. And therefore, Instagram, Twitter, there's like a denial of touch so that we can avoid the responsibility of reality. And we actually then want to create the pictures on the wall that then entertain us.
Yeah, I think rebuilding the cave was a good analogy there. I think that was pretty accurate. I think escaping it and then rebuilding it because we're unprepared for not having it in a sense.
Absolutely.
I think the point you're trying to make there maybe was like, we're taking for granted. I think the kind of rational approach is obviously reason is a hugely important, but like the rational approach, if it tries to encounter that void, we say without the protective shell or touch reality directly, if it's unprepared and badly formed, and I think this is a very classical point about philosophy, is if you have a badly harmonized soul or you're uncultivated, or if you read like Marcus Aurelius, he's constantly talking about fear, pain, and pleasure, these things which decay the soul, and if you're not kind of prepared for that journey to the unknown, let's say, there's a temptation to kind of rebuild something which is super safe and sterile and virtual, basically, to kind of reclaim that distance that's been. There's an intrusion and there's attempts to reclaim that distance. So there's a kind of dialectic there. There's a kind of dialectic of unpreparedness, we could say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and to me, and I'd be curious what you think about this, there's a way, because your book so well leads into this topic of Thymos, and you do so much on that topic, where it's almost like without Thymos and preparedness kind of go together. And if one is not prepared, then the response is to, in fact, get in your pod, or to deny yourself touch, or to end up in a situation where, like, you have that great example in your book where you talk about seeing a shark eat someone alive, right? And how people respond to it by just kind of standing there and filming it and not like trying to save their life. And how that right there suggests that when you're not prepared for the real, and eventually the real shows up, well, then you can't even respond. You certainly can't respond in a human way. You can only respond as if you're watching a film. And it's funny to think that it's almost like today, everything is a kind of film, pictures on the wall, everything is kind of digital. We don't really, it's almost like when you're talking about the lockdowns, it's almost like the lockdowns are a scene in a movie to us, not something that's happening in real life. And you as a good actor need to know your role, right? There's kind of this way in which you need to know your role and do what you're supposed to do. And it's this interesting way in which the loss of a sense of the human, which would require touch and would require rising to the occasion and not just getting Instagram followers, results in everyone being a kind of actor in a kind of movie playing on a screen that replaces reality. And you see this kind of playing out. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll just explain for people listening the shark situation.
Please.
The shark situation was basically someone I think it was in Sydney, was attacked by a shark. And now I grew up by the ocean, although in Ireland, so there's no dangerous sharks, but I just have this like natural instinct every time I go swimming. It's like, there could be something out there. It just kind of primordially triggers me or something. So, but like, so I just have this not fascination. It's not a pathology or anything, but it's a bit of a fascination for sharks.
Oh, sure.
And so I saw that shark attack thing. I clicked on the video on YouTube or something, and it was a news report, and it was basically this person who'd been attacked by the shark, and there was a video of it, but it was blurred, but you could see basically an ocean, something thrashing, and it's like got a red. And so, I mean, you could, it's blurred, but it's not really blurred. And these people, I couldn't believe it. They were just standing around like this, and like people were filming it. And I was just like, and it was obviously the point I made was there's nothing they could have really done. The guy was probably already dead. He was,
sure,
20 foot out into the water. But the reaction wasn't like, oh my God, scream, throw stuff, shout to him so we can maybe swim back, just even make an effort. Like, it was just complete immobilization of people in the sense that they don't really quite register what's happening. This isn't like the ability to turn everything into an image has kind of has kind of atrophied basically our understanding of what's real and how we should respond to things that are real. And I think that obviously this is a century politically of crisis. Is probably going to be the next century is probably going to be just perpetual crises. And and if we don't prepare to be able to understand, for example, what's a real crisis from what's a kind of exaggerated or fabricated crisis, we're really like in a bag of shit, basically. So yeah.
Well, if you can't tell a real crisis from a fake crisis, one, you're not going to be prepared for it. Two, you're not going to respond to it. Three. But then what's funny is because you talk about latches, like in order to gain the benefits of a crisis, of which might be thematic or help build you up, you have to know it's a crisis. So there's almost this way, if we have a Baudrillard kind of death of the real, he talks about the real is dead and all that different stuff. If conflict is dead, not in the sense that it's gone, but our ability to kind of identify it, then also a real problem is the likelihood of us gaining the benefits of conflict. Latches, like you talk about. And by the way, you're, again, just another example. Nobody talks about latches, and your discussion on that dialogue is tremendous. Where all the children, the sons are kind of mad at their fathers because they're like, you jerks, you gave us success, and now we don't have any occasions by which we can rise up and prove ourselves or kind of address and feel like we won our fight. And that's so funny because there is something where, if you have the World War II generation go off and they beat the Nazis or they, save the world or whatever, it's like every generation after that, you definitely feel it. There's a kind of like, oh, I guess we're just here, we're just watching on Netflix. And it's funny because I feel like when you bring out the latches dialogue, it really does kind of make, it hits home what the loss of Thymos does, what it feels like to not have the thematic taken care of. So I thought that was really good. But the point is that if we can no longer tell the difference between real conflict and false conflict, even if we are given the opportunity to gain what the younger generations want in latches, we will not be able to gain it because we will not be able to identify that it's a real conflict. So one, you're not going to respond to it. So the conflict's probably going to like destroy you. It's going to be really bad, or the real crisis, not conflict, with the real crisis is going to destroy you. And you're not even going to get some of the spiritual benefit, the spiritedness benefits that could come of that conflict. So to me, it really does speak to a major problem, because it's like you have crisis and no potential for the gaining of Thymos from that conflict, because you can't even identify what is a conflict. And arguably, and I'll give it back to you, if you're entering into a world of which people cannot tell what is a crisis and what is not a crisis, of which must be the case if you can't tell what's real from what's false, if you've lost the real, of which is tied to the loss of touch in your book and different things like that, which of course can be metaphoric for a larger picture of the death of the real in a Baudrillard sense, well, then there's no possibility of gaining Thymos. There's no possibility of spiritedness, and therefore addressing the whole of the human soul in those three parts. Yeah, we might get our eros. Yeah, we might get our rational, but we're not even going to have the ability to identify opportunities for addressing Thymos, because it won't be real to us.
Yeah, totally. I think there's the theme of courage is also, I think, what Lashes is most commonly known as. So there's a kind of general Socratic inquiry into what is courage, and then you have one soldier who says it is standing at your post, and then another, and he'll say, but what if you do it foolishly, or what if you move around while you're fighting? That's not, you could be cavalry, for example. Okay, that's okay. As an example, the usual, it's an example of courage, but not courage itself. And then you have another person who kind of exemplifies, you have another general who exemplifies a kind of rationalistic approach to courage. So he's like, courage is the knowledge of what is to be feared and what shouldn't be feared, or something on these lines. But then you see he's kind of merely being calculated. He's only acting when the conditions are favorable to act, basically. And you're like, hold on, okay. So you have this kind of epistemic crisis which comes along with this, and the backdrop to that, obviously, with the kind of theme of the end of history and the last man, was that the beginning of the dialogue, these two wealthy Greek men bring Socrates in because they're worried about their upbringing, and they're worried about their son's upbringing, because they claim that their upbringing was their fathers, who accomplished great things, fought great battles, and pulled off many great political, achievements and so on. And then they feel like, well, they've kind of inherited this luxury and this status, but they don't really feel like they've done anything. And I think this is a real noble acknowledgement. I think that it's a noble act to acknowledge this, because a lot of people will just go into, will just go, oh, what do you mean I haven't done anything? I've done loads of things, you know. So it's like this kind of shame that they exemplify is quite important, because I think in today's context we would say something like, oh, that shame is internalized guilt. Just enjoy yourself and don't worry about it. They kind of philosophically inquire into this feeling of shame. And they basically start to then come up with this quite interesting conversation of courage. And I think one of the most important things there is basically that as it pertains to the theme of the end of history and so on, that people at the end of history, we have this great knowledge of the ends, right? Like we're kind of like, we're the evolution of all this political struggle and history and rational enlightenment and so on, and technological innovation, but we have no knowledge of the means. We have no knowledge of the means to get there. We can read a history book, but that doesn't necessarily mean I have like a knowledge of it, you know, in a more intimate sense, you know. So it's almost like a contention between like the more of knowledge we gain of the ends of something, in a sense, the risk we have is the means we become ignorant of the means, and then we start to go into the crisis of, well, what happens if the end isn't really the end? What if something else happens and we need to respond? What do we do? We're kind of immobilized. So that's kind of where we're at, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, if for us, we think a crisis is, say, not having a lot of Instagram followers or not being upper class and middle class, then we're going to think we're addressing a crisis by dealing with those things. But all of those are just going to fall in the realm of calculation. Those are not necessarily going to be in the realm of spirit or Thymos, to go back, and you know, I'm using those interchangeably. So when we can't even identify what is a quote unquote real crisis, I mean, it's not really a crisis, say, to forget to take pictures at your party or to not have Instagram pride. And yet it's funny today, because literally you see in high school and middle school where people are like freaking out over that, and they think it's a real crisis, and they think once they take care of it that that's going to solve their problems, but then they do, and they have a meaning crisis. And it's interesting to think, I'll just have this as an aside, you know, there's a lot of talk for Reiki, the meaning crisis, mental health crisis, and different things. I think it is very interesting to think of that as a result of a lack of address of Thymos. You know, to see that there is not enough thematic resources in the culture today that could contribute to overcoming, say, the quote unquote meaning crisis, and how actually the meaning crisis can result from an overabundance and rational calculation, or eros, without any sort of feeling of rising to the occasion of overcoming, so that there's a point to these things. So it's interesting to think of Thymos in that context. But I really like I should note, like this is a wonderful dilemma. It's like, can you really have courage if you calculate everything and there's no risk? You know, don't you need to have ignorance to have courage? But at what point is ignorance become stupidity, right? It's kind of funny, because it's almost like it depends on if you succeed or not. Like if you succeed, well, then it was a matter of courage. But if you fail, you're an idiot, right? Because you should have calculated more. And it's interesting to think that actually that very kind of almost what I want to call a flip moment, the kind of unveiling, if it was stupid or like, is in itself part of the thematic risk, is part of the very doing it. If you fail, you're an idiot. You should have calculated more. If you succeed, it was courageous. And how it's interesting to think of the very kind of, it depends on what occurs. It's contingent in a way, right? It's kind of contingent on if you succeed or not, and how contingency in the Thymos seem to go together, or contingency and risk go together. And precisely because you might die on the battlefield, and then people may critique you for not being calculating, or maybe you were brainwashed by an ideology, or you were brainwashed by nationalism and patriotism to go out there. Those are all things people can say after you die, or if you fail, of which the very fact that you could be interpreted in those terms is part of the risk that you being willing to face could be why you get thematic resources for it. The very fact, like, I guess I think about, like, for example, if you spend a lot of time and make a lot of sacrifices to, say, write a book, and then nobody reads it, you know, oh, you're kind of an idiot, right? You know, what were you doing in different things? But if you say work really hard on the book and people read and go, oh man, that was so courageous, and you had faith in yourself and blah, 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 blah. Like how people could interpret you is dependent on what happens. And yet very often you have no control over what happens. And in fact, if a lot of people read your book, that might be evidence it sucks, because people like to read things that are not challenging, right? So, you know, but the very fact that you're willing to put yourself to that hermeneutical unknown, the very fact you're willing to make yourself susceptible to those those interpretations you don't have control over, seems in of itself to be thematic, or to be speaking to Thymos or courage, of which then if you're purely calculating, you know, if you're doing your search engine optimization, or you're figuring out, oh, what do people like? Let me put that out. You know, that goes against the risk of an unknown, of which seems necessary to dealing with, to having something, some Thymos, some spirit that is encouraged, that could be gained from that.
Yeah, I think perhaps what we could learn from this is that in order for us to have knowledge of the means, the ends have to be open. The ends have to be not 100% calculated and certain. There has to be some sort of doubt or some sort of insecurity or risk involved in those ends. Like, we're not really sure where it goes. So yeah, I think I think what you're describing as well there was kind of instantaneous gratification is kind of what we've fallen into. Instantaneous recognition. Sorry. Well, those are kind of now basically the same thing, right? We put something on social media, and we only put it out if we know it's going to get like a quantitative amount of feedback. Which is going to be, yes, good, well done, you did that. You know, it's like Nietzsche, for example. You know, didn't get very much to people. If you knew Nietzsche, probably in his time, especially at the early stages of his writing, he'd probably be like an obscure kind of loser figure. You know, like, who's this guy? But then obviously, like years later, it turns out he's one of the most important philosophers in history. So it's like there's a problem. I think there's a psychological problem, basically, we're tapping into here, which has emerged with these technologies of like instant feedback loops, and the ends having to be calculated, and we only act when the ends are calculated. And we're kind of losing the ability to act when it's open and we're not sure, and we could lose, we could be wrong. It's kind of one of the things I always like about philosophers that say that it could be wrong. It's like, well, that's actually, you know, your job isn't to calculate what is 100% right or predict what is 100% right. You know what I mean? The job of philosophy involves this sort of knowledge of means and how we should respond as well. And I think that the classical sense of the good life as well isn't like, well, here's a blueprint of the good life, now do this. The good life is a kind of process of how do you live. So it's a process of means just as much as it is an end, you know?
No, I think that's beautifully put. And well, you know, I've been increasingly interested in thinking about philosophy in terms of, and I think this aligns with what you're talking about, the Guardian class and the gymnasium, et cetera, so forth. Philosophy in terms of skill and ability, as opposed to just kind of premise. You know, it would seem as if what's really important is to somehow find I hate to use the word balance, but I'm going to use it here, a kind of balance between, say, Thymos, Logos, and Eros, right? And you need to somehow balance all three. Very problematically, and this is where I think we've made a mistake, those three fight one another. Like, I think we have this image of the triad of the soul as kind of a harmony, that they kind of exist together. No. They're like, the Logos is trying to like kick out the Thymos. The Eros doesn't care about either of them, and they're in a constant fight. And I think we see that today because of Logos. And I think you can also align that with the three infinites and more kind of Christian theology of good, beautiful, and true. You hear about those. So true, for me, I kind of associate good with Thymos, Eros with beauty, and Logos with true, if I were to use those terminologies. The thing is, we have to remember, beauty without good and truth is a force of destruction, because it seduces you into a falsity that's bad. Whereas truth without goodness and beauty is just kind of hard facticity that alienates you. And then you can have goodness without truth, and then it's ideological manipulation, right? Well, likewise, if you have, you know, Logos, but you don't have Thymos, well, then it gives you the meaning crisis we have today. If you have Eros without those two, then you're just consumerist last man or different things. But then, of course, if you have Thymos and you don't have those other two, then it can be, you know, a violent state of affairs that nobody wants to be in, right? You know, and that you're in the new book that I'll abstain from talking about, but it's so freaking excellent, everyone should read it, when you're talking about Hobbes. I never see, again, Raymond, I mean, you talk about these thinkers that no one talks about, you just do it in such an excellent way. A lot of people don't really get at Hobbes. You know, we have these stupid, I'm sorry, that's terrible, paraphrasing of Hobbes, Brutus, but not really getting at what he's discussing. So again, I'll abstain, but it's just excellent. Anyway, all three of those do not exist harmoniously together. They are trying to overtake and destroy the other. And if they succeed, we're in huge trouble. philosophy seems to be about developing the skill or a lot of philosophy seems to be about developing the skill, discernment, and habit of figuring out how to keep those three things from overtaking the other, and to not do it by getting rid of one of them. That seems to be the temptation. It seems to be what we've done today is we've tried to deal with this problem by getting rid of Thymos, by trying to get rid of it. And as a result, well, that's a problem because we're trying to solve a problem that should only be managed. Like the human condition is defined by a condition that can only be managed, which is keeping those three things that are trying to destroy one another together. Now, as you know, I like to talk about Hegel, tension, dialectic. It also gets, I think, into the common life of the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, different people, where it's in the particular and the actual and the lived that one only has the foundation by which to even begin determining how these three things should be balanced. Whereas if you're in this kind of universal technological, like no distance, it's not actually possible to figure out how to balance these three things because there's no actuality, there's no touch, if you will, there's no real by which can function as a compass by which to figure out how to go about employing these three parts of the soul in a manner that they don't eat each other. So once you become this kind of globalized neoliberal, whatever that word means, no one knows what that word means. It just sounds nice, but neoliberal. But once you're in that kind of space, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to figure out how to balance those three things. So, it makes me think, it seems to be classically, and I'll give it back to you. Classically, there was an understanding that philosophy was so tied to a kind of training. It wasn't like we think of it now, like determining the good life. Like, yep, here's, your formula, you do X, then you do Y, and then you do Z, and you'll have a good life. Here you go, Raymond. And you go, oh, thanks, Dan. Oh man, I'm going to have a good life now. Whereas for them, good life was like, hey, these are the skills, these are the ideas that you need. Now go forth. You have to do these things. It wasn't a formula. It was more like I wrestled for like 6 years and there were different moves. You would do like a Peterson or an ankle pick or a double leg takedown, different things. Is the knowledge of how to do a Peterson going to say, give you the good life? Well, no, you have to do it at the right time. You have to see it through. You have to have the courage you have certain technique by which will help you win the match. But knowing the technique is not winning the match in of itself. There are other factors that go into it. And so it makes me think how philosophy is kind of a teaching of like wrestling technique, if you will, but that is not the sum of the match. You then have to go do it and you have to go on the field. You have to be training. You can have a lot of technique, but not have the stamina or the strength by which to win the match. So there are these other things. And it seems as if we kind of lost a way of thinking about philosophy in terms of this kind of training, in terms of the gymnasium or skill, and that is contributing also to the loss of Thymos.
I think just to repeat a little bit what you were saying about the soul being in this contention with each other. I think that's exactly right. Like the solution of getting rid of one part is definitely a failed response. I think even the analogy I think Plato uses in I think it's Phaedrus with the charioteer, like the desiring horse is going his own way, and the spirited horse has to try give him kind of form and direction, but the form and direction can't come without that impulse, right? Yes. So, and then obviously you have reason who's kind of overseeing all this. So it's this form, and I think there's a lot of obviously, just to touch a little more on Thymos. If you read Plato in the Republic, there's a lot of talk of like you have to be spirited and kind of I suppose spirited and impulsive to an extent, but this can't become wretched and tyrannical at the same time. But you still need that initial impulse. And I think that the kind of, especially the kind of modern psychological response to, I think to the dangers of impulse is quite often, at least thymotic impulse, not erotic impulse, but at least thymotic impulse is quite often to dismiss it or to medicate it and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think there's a crisis of not being able to cultivate kind of potentially good energies and impulses based on the fact that we're not sure what the end is going to be. Like, will it lead to conflict? Will it lead to this? Will it lead to that? And there's a kind of crisis of, well, it may do, but if we don't take the risk, it's almost as bad as taking the risk. So what are we going to do?
No, I think that's very good. And well, it's almost like because avoiding death has become kind of our supreme thrust, Don't get me wrong, it's good not to want to die, right? But there's also seemingly something very problematic about not being able to see that avoiding death, if you lack any, say, meaning or spirit, is equally as bad. You know, there's like you need to avoid many things. It's not merely going to be enough to say avoid death if at the same time you have the meaning crisis. It will not be enough, say, to avoid, maybe you have meaning, but you don't engage in community, right? You just stay in your apartment all day. And so you're missing out on that kind of relationship. You know, I think Japan is a very strong case study for where meta-modernity ends up. You have these individuals that never leave their apartment. You have, you know, nets around buildings. Now you have an interesting, arguably you have a thriving kind of music and art entertainment, because that's basically all you have left is, you know, is kind of the creation of things that are entertaining, which of course there's a great place for art as such. But when art is trying to kind of fill in the lack of connection or thymos, there can be problems. So I think Japan is a very interesting case study where a lot of this is going. Now, I talked about that with Daniel Zaruba, but it's fascinating to me. Anyway, it seems as if, because we're so concerned about avoiding death, we've made calculation primary so that we avoid that death, but then lost the realization that actually death, I mean, this points to Heidegger, death has a very important role of making life precious. Like if there's no possibility of death, okay, you know, there's a problem there, right? Because, you know, that life doesn't have a scarcity, it doesn't have a rarity, it doesn't have a risk. So you live, but it also doesn't have a meaning to it. And it's interesting to think of, we have to balance wanting to live with being alive with other people, because there's also a thing where if you avoid others in a real sense, like a touch sense, not just a internet sense, then you're never questioned, right? You're never like, there's never a difference you encounter that questions you, that then you have to meaningfully defend your own choices to maintain. Like it's one thing, say, to decide, oh, I'm going to write a book and never give it to other people and never give it to people who won't like it. Because when you do that, it feels really good. You're like, yeah, I'm someone who does it. But when you give it to other people and they challenge you on it, then you find out if you're really serious about it, right? Because now people are calling you out and they say, don't like it. Do you really want to write a book, or do you only want to do it as a hobby, right? You know, when it's actually going to cost you emotionally or prove difficult, that's an entirely different thing. So it seems like there's these three parts of not being, you know, not wanting to die, but also not being afraid of death. This part of not avoiding other people because you're afraid of, say, being called out and questioning your own life choices. And then this kind of needing to take a risk so that life has meaning. And we don't seem to have a society of which is able to provide the resources for people to do all three of those. And as a result, we have these problems today that I think, well, one, manifests in the meaning crisis, but also you just see in this explosion of appeal to strongmen. Politically, we see it. Socially, we see it. And I think you just see these problems manifesting in the whole society.
Yeah, I think that might be a good kind of segue into the third part of Notes from the Pod, which is about armor. Because armor responds both to fear of death, fear of harm, and social relations. Because we're you know, we're not just afraid of death. Like it's like was it Sartre who wrote Hell as Other People? I can't remember Sartre. Yeah, it's like, that's it. I would say that hell isn't other people. Hell is like a really badly formed world with other people is probably more closely. But like other people are a potential hell, right? So sure. As well as being a potential salvation and so on. So it's very complex in that sense. But the third part, I think, armor was basically I looked at the Promethean myth, and the Promethean myth, as people know, is about when humans get fire. But Prometheus's brother, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he forgets to give humans. But basically, there's a kind of zoological theme to this, where the gods are creating all the species and animals, and they're creating, and it's an ontological thing of humans versus animals and so on. So animals are given things like fur and claws and wings to fly, or they can burrow under the ground. They're super big or they're super fast. So they're given means to survive, or preserve ourselves. So the humans are kind of left naked and bare. He describes them as like shoeless, naked, and bare, or something like that. So the kind of Hobbesian theme here too. And there's the kind of, my interpretation of that was basically that the kind of paradox of our nakedness was this innovative ability. So technology then comes into that, because we have fire, which is like symbolic of technology. So what I was trying to do with that, and I think this might help the social relations and fear of death question, would be to reevaluate technology as a defense mechanism, defense against harm, and a kind of way of negotiating and arranging our social relations, how we use technology to do this. And obviously the pod being where we're doing everything virtually is obviously very important there. But there's a kind of technological, what I might call a kind of technological hubris or technological egotism, which has gone into this. And I think that I made an attempt in that section to basically reevaluate this positivity of nakedness. Like the fact that we're naked kind of gives us a certain awareness of a limitation, which then becomes our very power. So technology could be seen not just as an ability to pick things up. Like an animal has claws, they can't take the claws off, for example. So if you're learning, I don't know, if you're learning if you're in the military and you're learning how to be a soldier, they might give you like a fake gun at first or something, right? So you have this like in order to make sure you can use it, or they might give you, or for here's a good example, like lifting weights. It's like, I'm going to give you heavier things to lift than you normally have to lift. I'm going to add effort onto you in order to gain your body to become better. If you're like learning, there's a kind of ascetic element to learning, in the sense that like, I'm going to remove myself from every distraction, because the only way I can learn is by kind of removing myself from mental stimulation to a certain extent. The only way I can really stimulate thought is to remove myself from other forms of stimulation. So you have this kind of detachment, this kind of letting go of things. Like technology isn't for humans just about picking things up and making them bigger and bigger and bigger and better and better. There's also this element we have to put things down, and then a certain heightened power or heightened awareness comes out of putting things down. Maybe it's kind of a bit of a almost monastic point. It's kind of an ascetic point in a sense, but I think we can say the same thing about our kind of social relations and our fear of death, is that like these things aren't overcome. The more and more distance we create, the more and more we virtualize, the more and more safe we make things, and so on.
No, the chapter on armor, I adored that chapter. I thought that was so well articulated. And I love how in the chapters of the book, you will refer to classical literature as a kind of framework by which to explore the thoughts, and that they each connect together. A few things. One, you were talking about Sartre, no exit, hell is other people. It's interesting to see, say, in Christian theology, where Jesus has to descend into hell and to go into hell in order to be resurrected. And so there's a way in which we have to go and encounter other people, precisely to kind of be called out the choices we've made of what we've decided to do, to see if we're serious about it. Because, if you're doing something different that doesn't fall into the social order, say you're in these online intellectual communities doing work like this, and people say, oh, what do you do? And like, I do intellectual work at a university. No. Oh, no, I don't. And they're like, well, what are you doing then? Are you getting paid for it? Blah, blah, blah. And how that kind of forces you to confront your own choices to see if you're serious about it. Are you doing it because you value it in of itself, or are you doing it because you're looking for affirmation? If you're looking for affirmation, which is not a kind of acknowledgement for a courageous act, but an affirmation from like a social script, the facing that seems necessary for addressing the whole soul. And it can be tempting not to face that, because it is difficult, right? So, it's interesting. Yeah, hell is other people, but you also need to go through hell to have that finished resurrection, I think. But the other thing I want to say, I think it's almost like today we're doing this thing where we're creating armor to avoid touch. If I were to use language from your book, like we're creating armor to avoid reality, because I can't help but see the act of, say, going to a party and taking pictures as a creation of armor. It's kind of creating a defense mechanism against the real people there. It's creating a kind of armor between the real of the event, so that you can keep it in the superficial and not have any actual kind of Buber. If Javier Rivera would talk about Martin Buber and kind of encounters with other people, like if you truly encounter another person, that could be terrifying, and that could be very, very difficult, exactly in the Sartre way. So screw that. Let's just tweet, take pictures, or talk about the movies we saw. Because even that, like, people are like, oh, what movies you see recently? Oh, what have you been watching? Like, it's funny because when I was reading the armor chapter, I was thinking about kind of small talk, and how small talk has a kind of armoring to it. Like, what do people ask about? They ask about how's work? and that's the capitalist script. That's not you. You're referring to a capitalist script that's defending you. They ask, what movies have you seen? You're referring to the Netflix. That's a kind of armor. It's kind of moving away from you, pointing to socially accepted paradigms like Netflix and movies and work. Or they ask, how was the game? Watching sports. And there is something about, it's funny, like I couldn't help but also see the whole stadium as a kind of armor. Like you're not on the field, you're watching it, but you get to feel like it's our team. So you get to claim that it's your team without being on the team. And I'm not saying it's bad to watch sports, but there's always a danger with everything where there's a kind of identification with conflict that you yourself are not taking any risk in. And it's a kind of armor from that sort of defense and risk in the act of watching. But anyway, all of the kind of small talk seems to be a constant creation of different armors to avoid the real of you and your choices that you've made for yourself without assistance of a social script. And that's because, if you remove that armor, it's a funny move where if you remove that armor, you're naked and it's just you, what you've done for yourself. And maybe there's nothing there. And it's kind of terrifying to face that. But it's funny to think that that's actually the beginning of a potential power. Like it is precisely the loss of that armor that can be opening up a certain human power and possibility that we lose sight of and lose the ability to even implement if we're overly armored. And I'll give it back to you. Rather it be with small talk, the subjects of small talk, rather it be with digital technologies, rather it be with zeitgeist, all of these things are forms of creating an armor that help us feel comfortable, but in that very comfortable, detach us from the very power that we have as human beings, of which we could do, we could do who knows.
Yeah. I think it's like the potentiality of discomfort. I think that is largely what we're talking about. Like an existential crisis could be, it is kind of this moment where like, I don't know what I am. How do I explain myself? How do I justify myself to people? What am I doing? But in this very kind of confusion, there's something opens up, a certain, as you might say, like innate interest and innate passion could form once you get rid of the external script you've been given. Like it reminds me of, just to quote Fight Club, I have to quote it at least once in every conversation, but it's like he's talking to Edward Norton and Brad Pitt are talking, and they're like saying, and interesting enough, just thematically, he's in a bathtub, so he's naked, so it kind of fits thematically. But he's like saying, I finished school, and then my dad said college, then I rang him up 5 years later. What now? Work. Okay. Now what now? Married, so on and so forth. Although these things today would probably change into something else, but
sure,
those were the kind of scripts, at least of the 90s or whatever. So it's like these kind of scripts we get into how we should live. I think the and of course that film is all about going into the most uncomfortable thing you could do, like you're underground in a sweaty cold place beating each other up, like, so it's this kind of existential power of discomfort, at least temporary discomfort, maybe not like perpetual ongoing discomfort, but kind of harsh bouts of discomfort, we could say, kind of liberate us in a weird way from these scripts. These scripts are our armor, but they give us kind of purpose and they give us some sort of direction, but they can become our enemy in a sense, because they kind of stop us encountering, as you were saying, that kind of alien other, that kind of weird potentiality, that kind of, they stop you questioning and becoming aware on a certain level, which then breaks things open to something higher and better, more meaningful. Because normally people get quite depressed and quite purposeless when they are overly scripted, we could say.
Well, and to me, there's something about human action and human organization that naturally and emergently creates scripts that then become this thing that we follow for direction. And it's nice to have direction. But the problem with thoughtless direction is that leads potentially into what Hannah Arendt calls the banality of evil, which is when evil, like for her, true evil doesn't occur until it's everydayness. Like by the banality of evil, she does not mean the boredom of evil. She means where evil is every day. She obviously has the trial of Eichmann. Eichmann's a vacuum salesman. He's just scheduling the trains for the Holocaust. It's just every day. He's just doing his job. He's putting on his cap. drinking his coffee, scheduling the trains. Like it becomes very everyday. He has a script. He has a role that he follows. So the danger of roles is that it feeds straight up into the banality of evil. And for her, it's important. The reason I like the banality of evil, and we'll talk about a lot with, with say Philip Rieff and the belonging again, is because the banality of evil shows that evil, to use language that we've been discussing, is actually a result of a lack of thymos, not a overabundance of thymos. We tend to think of thymos causes evil, and don't get me wrong, thymos that is out of balance with the other two parts, I'm saying logos and eros, yes, it becomes a force of destruction, but beauty is a force of destruction without those, all of them are forces of destruction without the other three. But we assume that thymos is going to give you the brutest state of nature. But actually, in the modern world, what Hannah Arendt is pointing at is that the lack of thymos is the cause of a lot of evil, not the overabundance of it. Maybe there is a period in human civilization where the overabundance of it, you can look at like, always like the Icelandic literature, like the Volsung saga, the Edda poems, where it's these endless revenge cycles where somebody kills you. It's very Viking, Iceland, different things like that. And it's very good. Okay, well, that's an example of an unbalanced thymos, for example. But then in the modern world, you have the complete deficit of thymos, which then you're just following logos. Okay, the train schedule goes here, and we make sure that they pick up, the Jews there, and they take them off to Austria. It's like very calculated. Eichmann is calculating, and she points out continually that Eichmann on trial is like, I did nothing wrong. I did what I was told to do. And he sees himself as kind of moral. I followed orders. Therefore, I was a good person. I did what I was supposed to do. And how that banality of evil is really for her what the modern world needs to be aware of, and to really pay attention to, because it's not where it's this thoughtlessness that occurs. And it's actually interesting to think in those terms that in a very real sense, logos cannot be fully rational without thymos. Like you actually can't even be fully rational if you don't have this ability to break out of scripts, because you outsource your rationality so much to the script that you're really smart, but your smartness comes from something that's not you. So logos is then you're not even able to actually be full. That's kind of the irony of the Enlightenment, actually, in my opinion, is that the Enlightenment so much focuses on rationality as able to address all these parts that rationality ends up not even that rational, because it has nothing to do with the actual real human being, who is this triad spirit that is these three parts. So like an autonomous rationality ends up not even being rational because it is no longer organized by the truth of the full human being that has logos, the logos, myth, eros, and thymos. If you have a rationality that's organized by a conception of human beings that's purely logos, purely rational, then you're not even rational anymore. And that's kind of the irony that Hannah Arendt is talking about. And then, of course, that would mean, and then I'll give it back to you, is that avoiding this banality of evil requires putting down our armor. It requires vulnerability. It requires avoiding scripts and being vulnerable. It's basically like what Hannah Arendt points to, the choices between vulnerability or the banality of evil. Like if you're not going to have vulnerability and be able to step outside of scripts and escape thinking in those terms, then it's only a matter of time before you fall into a kind of thoughtless evil. And funny enough, we tend to think of vulnerability as a kind of evil. You're at risk, right? You could die, right? But what we're seeing here is that actually vulnerability is precisely what is necessary to avoid ending up, say, an Eichmann or someone like that.
Yeah, I think what's happened in modernity to a large extent could be we've moralized proud impulse, because proud impulse can be unpredictable and violent. But as we've moralized and inhibited proud impulse, kind of thymotic impulse, we've liberalized calculation and self-interest to like massive extents. So you start seeing these kind of paradoxical evils where you see the evil of pure calculation with Eichmann and so on and so forth. Or the evil of just like pure detachment of the people watching this guy getting eaten by a shark and then just like filming it.
Yeah.
I think that another point just about the kind of harmony of the soul and this contention between these three different parts is that in Plato, one thing that comes out, especially in the Republic, is that reason needs spirit in order to regulate desire. So you see desire, and like a kind of desire which is out of control culturally could be like consumerism, late capitalism. Individually, it could be like addiction and so on, or a kind of infantile self-gratification, which is totally out of control. And then in Plato, I think reason really, it's not so much that like reason has this problem where it's like I think reason wishes, in a sense, if we could kind of give, if we could give reason its own desire, we could say that reason might desire to get rid of spirit and to control desire directly.
Absolutely.
But it can't. It needs spirit, and it's kind of resentful for needing it. Because I think we are, as humans, like kind of resentful. Like, I wish we could stop doing these things, but I can't really justify stop doing these things which are destructive and so on. So you need the kind of absurd, proud spiritedness to kind of intervene, in a sense, sometimes. So yeah.
I really like the word resent that you just used. The conflict of mind opens with a paper called Truth Organizes Values. And it's the notion that what you believe is true organizes what you think is honest, what you think is good, what you think is evil, so on and so forth. So of course, it's really important to get the right conception of what is true, because that's going to organize your values and by extension, rationality. What you think is rational is relative to what you think is true. If you think it's going to rain today, it's rational to bring an umbrella. But let's say it doesn't rain. Does that mean you were irrational? No, you were very rational relative to what you thought was true. It just happened to be the case that what you thought was true was false. And so therefore we have to determine something pre-rational to figure out how to organize what is rational. And that's always, of course, the tricky thing. Like, how do you arrive at a pre-rational thing using rationality? And that's kind of the conflict of mind. The word resentment is really good, because there's a way in which rationality resents the fact it needs a truth. There's a way in which rationality resents the fact that it cannot organize itself without a pre-rational conception. So it wants to deny that. It wants to deny that and believe in the possibility of autonomous rationality. And then following Adorno and Horkheim in the dialectics of rationality, of the Enlightenment, that's of course how we get totalitarianism, is autonomous rationality. And that gets into like David Hume and different things like that. It's interesting to think because it's interesting to think when we talk about the triadic soul, the soul having these three parts, is that a rational conclusion? What is the conclusion of that? It's like it is, but it isn't, right? It's based on experience. It's based on relationships. It's like more holistic than just a rational conclusion. But the moment I say it, it sounds like a rational premise. I can only present ideas to you in a rational premise. So there's a way in which language contributes to making it seem like everything is rational, because everything is intellectual. Like, you intellectualize, but really the premise that the soul is triadic in the way that we're describing is not merely a rational conclusion. It's based on your own lived experience. It's based on community. It's based on a lot of things that cannot be shown in the Zoom call, thus making it seem like it is just purely a rational assent, right? That's kind of the irony. We're kind of stuck with that. But really, the idea of the triadic soul is based on a fuller experience of life, right? And then from that, you then organize rationality relative to that triadic structure. But of course, then there's always an element of faith, because what if you misinterpreted those past experiences? You have to remember, and this Johannes will emphasize memory, and there's kind of this remembering of these experiences you had that ultimately point to something more triadic than autonomous of a single value. This is funny, though, because it would suggest that if we're increasingly living inside a pod, if we're increasingly isolated from experience, then in fact, we have a constant experience of something that's more just intellectualism, because we're only doing talks, we're only reading, we're only consuming. It feels like all there is logos and eros. And it's interesting, and I'll be curious what you think about this. It's interesting to think that the death of distance, of which ironically leads to isolationism, actually contributes to then having experiences that make of just, say, the laptop, of which seems to point to a world of which is captured by a non-triadic soul, but by a kind of soul of just logos and eros. And so then we organize rationality accordingly, and we're in trouble. But we're no longer, it's like precisely because we're always in the cave, we are not going into the world to have the experiences that would point to the existence of a triadic soul, thus making us think it's rational to have a conception of human beings as purely calculative or purely pleasure-seeking. And that's then how we organize ourselves. And then it's almost like a total depravity. You know, in Christianity, there's that notion of total depravity where if you're in despair, you don't even know in your despair. Like if you're damned, you don't even know you're damned. It's like really dire because you don't even know you're missing out on that triadic soul because you don't even have the experiences to point to it. So it really truly is like a Plato's cave that the door is shut. It's like a boulder is like rolled in front of the entrance. You know, it's like, it's truly an all consuming problem. And it's like a pod, like you say.
Yeah, I think the boulder is shut and then we have a screen with a door in it put over the boulder. And then, like, because that's kind of the paradox of this technology. Like it's not a kind of inhibition on thinking in truth in a kind of traditional conservative sense of like, you know, these are the scripts you have, these are the gods you have, and you believe it and you don't question. There's this sort of there's this kind of sophistry, I suppose we could call it. It's kind of the kind of technological sophistry of we're gonna pretend that we're moving, and we're pretend we're cave adventurers, and we're gonna get to the top. But really, the boulder has been completely sealed in, and we've got a screen with a door on it, you know. And I can kind of put on my virtual reality headset, and I can imagine I'm climbing out of there, but I'm not. I'm just stuck there. I think this is, as you were saying, the autonomous rationality problem. Really, something that's kind of maybe crossed my mind recently is that the more this autonomous rationality kind of takes over, the more phenomenologically ignorant we become.
Yeah.
And that kind of harmonizing of the soul, as you were saying, it can't happen. Like I can't rationally explain this harmonizing. I can't empirically prove this harmonizing of a soul. This is something I have to kind of phenomenologically encounter. I'm limited to it in a sense. I don't have complete kind of empirical or rational access to it. I'm sort of mediated to it by this phenomena of being a human being and having these contesting impulses and these feelings and these thoughts, and I have to kind of make sense of it on a phenomenological level as well as a rational level. And I think that's the danger we see, is that our ability to phenomenologically engage is sort of being atrophied, I would say.
Dang, that phrase phenomenological ignorance is really useful, because that's exactly what that's really succinct. So a few things. One, I think you're correct. Rationality resents its reliance on truth. So it loves phenomenological ignorance, because then it can present itself as truth, because it's not encountering anything that kind of unveils to it its inability to be autonomous without losing something. You know, if rationality is autonomous, it's totalizing and kind of terrorizing and dehumanizing. But if I'm phenomenologically ignorant, then rationality can convince itself quite easily that it is not dehumanizing, because it doesn't have any experiences that it would be forced to incorporate to unveil itself as phenomenologically ignorant. Likewise, I can sit down in the cave, look behind my back and say, oh, there's a door. I can leave whenever I want. And since I never go up and try to open the door, then I'm phenomenologically ignorant of the fact that the door is just a screen, and I can convince myself that I'm in the cave because I want to be in the cave. Because at any point it's almost like in Plato's cave now, you're not chained down anymore. You're like literally sitting there, you're having a good time, and you look over, you say, oh, I could leave, the door's right there. But you just never do, because you always find a good reason never to check. And that's what rationality and its resentment of truth is always doing. It's always giving you a good reason to keep sitting there and enjoying the Instagram images on the screen, and to never go check that door, that if rather you just sit there and believe you could leave whenever you want. So that's the kind of total depravity of this phenomenological ignorance. As a side note, I like that phrase as well, because it kind of points to what Dr. Cadell last talks about with the phenomenological journey in Hegel, where, you know, for me, the movement from self-consciousness to reason is the opening up to the other from your own enclosed kind of worldview and way of thinking. So the movement from self-consciousness to reason is a really big deal. That's where you kind of open to the other and the possibility of truly being wrong. And it's almost like, you know, to use that language, it's like what we do is we get to that stage where we can make the choice into reason, but we remain phenomenologically ignorant so that we don't even know there's a choice. There's not even a possibility of moving into reason. So that language is really, really useful. I think all of this speaks to Paul Virilio too, when you were talking with the great Joshua Hansen on the accident unveils the substance. If you have a society, if you never leave your laptop, there's basically no possibility of an accident. And if you're never vulnerable, there's no possibility of an accident. With Paul Virilio, and I love that thought, where it's actually the accident that unveils the substance. The unexpected shows you the truth of the thing, right? But if you are so calculating, if you're so phenomenologically ignorant, then there's no possibility of accident, which means you can never get to the substance. The classical term between an accident, the squirrel is white, but squirrels don't have to be white, whereas the substance is the actual squirrelness, like the genetic code, and that kind of play on both, where it's actually the shipwreck that tells you what a ship really is, right? You think you know what a ship is, but then when the shipwreck occurs, oh wait, now I know what a ship is. And you actually need the mistake, you need the accident, you need the unpredictable, you need the vulnerability for the truth to come forth. Well, in this sense, what we're saying is that if you have a phenomenological ignorant world, there is no possibility for an accident to occur that unveils the triadic soul. There is no possibility of something occurring that unveils the actual nature of human beings. And so we don't know the actual nature of human beings. And as a result, we organize rationality according to an idea of the nature of human beings, of which then contributes to totalitarianism, the banality of evil, and the meaning crisis. So it's really interesting to think of Paul Virilio, and I'll give it back to you, in this context, because phenomenological ignorance then contributes to never having an accident or vulnerability that is necessary for the revelation of the triadic human soul, of which would then organize rationality to take seriously Thymos and a lot of these classical thinkers that we're not today. And as a result, we're ending up in boredom, meaning crisis, banality of evil, and then just being susceptible to power and the structures of the state and things like that. No, and Raymond, let me say, I really appreciate the work that you've done mentioning Mr. Virilio, what you've said about Paul Virilio. It's just funny because he's one of those people you encounter and you're like, how in the world did I not know about this person? It's like, what was going on? So I think he's interesting to bring in here.
Yeah. I think anyone who encounters him in the past few years has the same feeling because of how accurate he is in describing. And I think the reason he's so accurate is because he has this understanding of something which doesn't seem like a crisis or a problem, but actually is. And I think that's instantaneous communication. And I know we're doing it right now, but it's obviously every time people criticize technology, it's normally people doing it through Skype, and it's a caveat of like, yes, we're doing this through, but whatever. It's not all bad, but he has this general, he's this general understanding of its implementation into the pre-existing systems that were already there with the economy and the political order, and globalization in general. How this was going to be what seemed like a super efficient, better way of living actually turned out to be a massive crisis, which fits into what you were talking about with the unveiling of the substance of the accident and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think Virilio, for the sake of notes from the pod, his relevance is very much in the spatial kind of displacement that we find ourselves in today. And there's something I kind of jotted down earlier. I don't think I mentioned it in this much detail in the book, but there's this kind of theme which seems to stick out between like instantaneous, and it kind of corresponds to our topic of Thymos and the spirit and the harmonizing of the soul and so on, of kind of instantaneous gratification, the inability to kind of discipline oneself or delay gratification or postpone gratification, all of these things which seem to be very much thematic of things like maturity and discipline and a kind of work ethic and all these kind of themes. I would say Virilio is very much a thinker of the sort of like geographic instant gratification in the sense that we have images, and not just images, but the sort of rapid movement of information, whether that could be money, whether that could be images, whether that could be simulating, like the metaverse, for example, this kind of ability to simulate our surroundings. And then of course there's biotechnology, which he also touches upon, which is a sort of ability to we'll say duplicate the human, reduce the human to a piece of information, but then kind of duplicate him through a genetic copying and so on. So this is like one of the biggest crises, of course, which Virilio touches upon, and not just Virilio. There's lots of other thinkers, as Fukuyama. There's Peter Sloterdijk as well in one of his essays touches upon this. It seems to fit into all of what we're talking about here in some vague way. I'm not even quite sure yet how, but I've kind of got intuitive understanding of how. But yeah, like I think Virilio kind of grounds us. He kind of opens the door in many ways to understanding these crises of technology as, in a sense, spatial, and one of information, and how information moves around, I think, is important.
No, I think he's extraordinarily prophetic. So prophetic, in fact, that it takes it takes the world about 50 years to truly grasp what he was saying. And again, I think the conversation you had with the wonderful Joshua Hansen was outstanding. And it's interesting to think of how a crisis for those with Thymos is an opportunity for Thymos to be met. But when a crisis hits that there is no thematic element, then it's like an effacement. The crisis becomes a kind of effacement. And what seems to be interesting about this new kind of crisis, dare I say, which seems different than, say, the invasion of the barbarians or something like that, is it's a crisis that's in the form of a success. It's a crisis of which is concealed as a crisis. And so you don't even know you need to use a thematic element or something like that. Like, isn't it good to avoid death? Isn't it good to say live forever? Isn't it good to avoid pain? Isn't it good to have pleasure? Like, in order to even understand this as a crisis almost is a step. Like, that's kind of unique, like a crisis that conceals the fact that it's a very crisis. Like, for most of human history, this is a generality. You would go out and you'd say, oh, there's a drought. It's not a matter of debate that this is a crisis. Like, literally the plants are dying. We can see it. Literally the barbarians are coming. It's like objective is a dangerous word, but I want to say it's more objective, or let's say it's more object based, like something you can touch, to allude to your book. I can go out and literally touch the dead plants. I can literally feel the bows and arrows from the barbarians. And so there's something about the crisis of the past that was very objective kind of sense, right? Whereas this crisis is so interesting because, yes, information is data, yes, it's physical, yes, blah, 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 but it's very invisible. It's very in the background. It's very debatable because you have to interpret the meaning of the information. A drought does not need you to interpret it. The drought happens and kills your plants. The invasion of the barbarians don't need you to interpret it. It is right there. But in order for you to understand that pleasure can be a kind of crisis, in order for you to understand that, say, Instagram can be a kind of problem, that requires an act of interpretation. That requires an act of understanding of which the very enjoyment of the entity makes you not have. Like, the very fact that Netflix is enjoyable makes you not understand it as a potential problem. And I think what Paul Virilio is getting at is that new kind of element of the concealment of the problem in a very experience of what makes it seem like it's not a problem, which is like a new level of abstraction in human history in a way that I think Paul Virilio is kind of talking about, which makes it, again, like you literally have to argue with people and convince them, and then I'll give it back to you. You have to convince them that pleasure is a problem or that avoiding pain is a problem. Like, you had to write a book on Notes from a Pod. You had to write a book to make a case. No one had to write a book to show that freaking droughts are bad. And yet a book is needed to convince people that something is going on. I think for me, like, that's kind of what, and I'd be curious what you think about it. Like, to me, a part of what Virilio is talking about is precisely like the crises of today are things that do not necessarily give themselves over as a crisis. Like, arguably, the loss of distance is a great thing. You can connect with more people. Arguably, all these technologies are a good thing because you can do so much. And yet what Virilio understood is, well, every new technology, every ship brings a shipwreck. Every technology brings a corresponding negative that is concealed in the very functionality of that thing. And almost the problem is precisely because these new technologies are so functional and so efficient that it becomes very difficult to see, and I'll give the negative side of them.
Yeah, I definitely think that was a good way of putting it. He has this idea called philofolly, which is a kind of funny play of words, like philosophy and folly. And I think it kind of corresponds. I can't remember the exact quotation from about like of what he says it is, but it corresponds to this ignorance concerning how things will play out. I think he mentions the substance being unknown to the engineers who make the thing, which unveils the substance. And I think one of the things you mentioned there was interesting was the like distance and touch. So obviously, if you go out and you're like, oh my God, the crops are dying, this is a crisis. I'm not gonna be like, I'm gonna go write a book about it. It's like, well, just how do we get new crops, right? How do we fix this? Like, it's not really a crisis in the same way. At least it's not an epistemic crisis.
Yeah,
it's just a practical crisis. So I think that it's funny because what we have with this movement of information and kind of media infrastructure is we have a world where all events are extremely distant. So like we're talking about what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. Well, I've never even been to Ukraine or Russia, sure. But all I hear about all day is Ukraine and Russia. And I've mentioned it in things I've written about. I act as if this is this immediate thing. And I suppose through the economy now with the energy crisis, it pretty much is an immediate thing, at least if you're in Europe anyway. So in a way it is an immediate thing. But to what extent is it immediate, and to what extent does it affect me, and how should I respond, and how it's kind of impossible to just respond in this practical sense anymore. Like everything that happens is around us, but it's around us through a distance which is traversed through information to an economic obviously structures as well, to a certain extent, where an immediate response like the barbarians are at the gates, all right, get your sword, get your shield, let's go to the gates. It doesn't really suffice anymore. Like we're kind of stuck in this kind of like inability to really know the nature, the proximity of the crisis. There's a crisis, yes, of course, but how does it affect me, and what's the proximity, and how urgent is the response? These are all things which aren't clear today, I think.
I think that's very well put. Well, it's interesting too, because I love how you put that. Like when you see the plants are dead, you don't have to go, well, let me go read a book real quick to know what I need to do, right? That's really funny. What's interesting today is if you have to be convinced that these supposed benefits of the modern world are in fact problems, that means you have to do an act of logos to convince logos to give up some of its power. So you have to kind of humble yourself before the very thing that has the power. And that's like the problem. It's like you have to go to the dictator to convince the dictator not to be a dictator. That's a really big problem. Like, why would logos give it over, since you're literally having to meet it on its terms? It seems like that's part of the problem right there. And then in addition to that, distance itself is a kind of armor, to allude to your book. Like, distance is armor. And the problem is if we're already existing in always already in a world of distance, in the way that we're describing, that funny enough is this is the weird thing, is precisely by Russia and Ukraine being made immediate to you, it feels like it's not distant, and yet it's very distant. It's not as immediate as the computer. Like, all of these problems have to present themselves as not the problem. Like the problem where we're kind of treating distance as immediacy only works because it doesn't feel like these things are distant. It feels like Washington, D.C. is in my living room. It generally feels like Ukraine is here. And yet actually it is distance, but it has to phenomenologically present itself as if it's not distant, because if it did, you'd realize it was distant and you were being distracted by your immediacy, right? So it has to have that self-deception mechanism. All right, so we're all living in a kind of disembodied state, like where we're towards something distant, of which is an act of armor, and armor takes away from the vulnerability that we need to have the true human power. So what's also really interesting is if everyone today is always already armored by distance, that means in order to access our full human power, to allude to your book, we have to have an act of taking the armor off. Whereas in the past, it's almost like you were born without armor, right? Like you kind of started in the place where before, like you started without armor. And then it was like seeing power in that. Whereas today you start with armor, and it's almost like you have to have today there's kind of a unique act you have to do, which is the taking the armor off. Where in the past, you didn't have to take the armor off. You already didn't have the armor. But today, it's like, so I guess to sum up, there's like two things now that are very interesting going on. It's a unique error where we have to consciously take the armor off, where in the past they didn't have to do it. And today we have to use logos to convince, let me use rationality, logo, we have to use rationality to convince rationality not to be autonomous. Because the givenness of the crisis is not, because the crisis are not given in their very facticity. Crops tell you they're a crisis just by being dead, whereas comfort does not tell you it's a crisis by being comfort. You have to reason that it's a crisis. And in order to overcome that crisis, you have to combat autonomous rationality, which the very reason you used to determine that that was a crisis is and seeks. And so those to me are kind of two unique attributes of the modern crisis that Paul Virilio is pointing to. And really, it basically suggests, because fighting those two things is so difficult, that it's basically only going to be the accident, only going to be the unintentional that would unveil this on a mass scale to average people.
Yeah, I think the point you made was perfect about beginning without armor was actually a good thing in a certain sense. There was a positive element to that, which because once you get armor, then you don't have to think about it. But right. Now that, but if you're born with it, then all of a sudden you don't experience being without it. Then all of a sudden you have to think about it, and then yes. That's sort of, I think, the kind of in a sense a crisis. And it kind of reminds me of Paul Virilio's point about how every crisis becomes global now through these information networks, and of course the economy as well. And these information networks, by the way, they're not just like, ones and zeros or like, here's some facts. It's like emotion as well, because the information means images, sound, narrative, images of desire, images of fear, images of everything. And so it's a synchronization of emotion at the same time. And I think that this distance that we have, because we are sitting in our pod and we have a large distance from the dangerous and things and annoying other people and so on. I don't blame anyone for wanting distance from these things, but there's this problem of like, once we're in there and we have these distance of these things, the thing which then traverses that distance, the information infrastructures, then bring everything bad into our world. And we're like, oh, now we're covered in not only bad things, but like things that we don't even know if they're really bad or good or not. So there's this awful kind of there's this kind of tragic effort to build up something, and as we build it up, something else comes back in. And something that came to mind, actually, have you ever played Skyrim as a video game? And there's this, I remember playing it years ago, and there was this armor you get in it, like for armor, and you put the armor on, and it was really weird. The armor poisons you every so often. So you put it on and it has this like magic power where it protects you from like fire or something. But every so often it just releases poison, and your health bar goes like halfway down, like, for God's sake. So it's like, I think this is a kind of good way of looking at it, being like, we build up this armor, but at the same time there's something the armor is reflecting back into us and affecting us in a way which we didn't predict, and it's not very good.
That's amazing. That metaphor is really, really good. So the armor we are describing is a product. Having the armor necessitates phenomenological ignorance. To use that phrase you were saying earlier, because you have the armor precisely because you do not experience a world in which forces you to begin without the armor. So the moment you have the armor, there's a kind of phenomenological ignorance of what it's like not to have the armor, right? Like, to use that phrase earlier. Here's the problem. From that place of phenomenological ignorance, it is always rational to keep the armor on. This is the problem. Like, the armor is always rational. The only way that taking the armor off would be rational is if you have the phenomenological experience that unveils the human has a triadic soul, right? But the very rationality that is necessarily generated by the armor makes it irrational to ever go and have experiences that point to human beings as entities with triadic souls, right? So this is this to me actually kind of speaks to game theory. How in game theory, which I think game theory is not taught like it should be, but that's an entirely different subject. Game theory, a Nash equilibrium is where you get a suboptimal result because everyone is rational. Everyone does what is rational, and so you get a suboptimal result. And so this is a big problem because it shows that rational actors lead to a nuclear apocalypse. So in order to avoid a nuclear apocalypse, you need people to be irrational. Now, I actually think this is why the category of non-rational is huge. You know, we tend to have rational, irrational. I think we desperately need the category of non-rational, which is action of which cannot be fully understood in rational terms and yet is necessary for the organization of rationality. The notion of a triadic soul is a non-rational premise. It is a premise of which cannot be fully grasped by rationality, and yet it becomes the organizing principle of rationality. And if you don't have non-rationality, you end up in a game theory, you end up in a Nash equilibrium. You end up in a suboptimal result. So basically what this means is that we are always already today born with armor on that sets us up for a Nash equilibrium. Like we're always, like all of us right now are automatically in a Nash equilibrium situation, unless we introduce non-rationality to our thinking and to our vocabulary. But here's the funny thing. What is non-rational to us must necessarily be interpreted as irrational to other people. The social order must experience your non-rationality that you know you need to go through to avoid a Nash equilibrium. Everyone else must see as irrational. And so that's going to create a horrible social pressure not to do the non-rational. But that means there's a horrible social pressure to stay in the Nash equilibrium, to stay in the suboptimal result. So, well, that means the following. Basically, the only hope that any of us have to do the non-rational that we need is Thymos, like to develop the spiritedness of Thymos. But where do we get that from? How do we train that if the social order is completely in the business of making irrational the practices of Thymos, right? And this is where you start to see the total depravity of logos, like pure rationality, and why autonomous rationality is so totalizing and difficult to break, because it creates a social condition that makes the practices that one needs to gain the Thymos that we need to habituate ourselves to the non-rationality that helps us avoid Nash equilibrium. It makes that irrational, and it makes that crazy, and it makes that stupid. I think here you can see some, like maybe some wisdom, and then I'll give it back to you, some wisdom in sort of this kind of Christian notion of Jesus as rejected, as the least will be first, as this kind of nobody understands him. And there is in many religions and many myths, this kind of narrative of the crowd being a problem, right? And, you know, different things like that, which is kind of thematic, right? There's kind of a Thymos in all of that. And it goes to show you, I think what's interesting is actually, I think, game theory. Game theory, unfortunately, at universities is taught as a way to be more rational. I think that's the exact wrong lesson of game theory. Game theory should teach you of the necessity of a new category of non-rationality. But everyone uses game theory to figure out how to be really rational by avoiding. No. You are not really rational if you avoid a freaking Nash equilibrium. You're non-rational. But here's the problem. The moment you do the non-rational, it's rational to do the non-rational. So you can always think of it as a rational act. And you miss the role of the non-rational in the organization of the rationality to make it optimal, because it automatically consumes it the moment you do it. It makes it seem like it was just rational. And I think college universities have fallen for that sleight of hand. They've missed the role of non-rationality. But basically, and then I'll give it back to you, for me, the accidents that Paul Virilio is kind of pointing to. So like autonomous rationality, what happened when the unexpected has occurred, then autonomous rationality has unveiled its substance as ultimately being empty. It doesn't have a substance. And power then rushes in to try to hide that. But the very absence of an ultimate substance shows the need for Thymos, because it needs Thymos in order to have substance to itself. But we have to interpret, see what's in it. But the revelation of the need for Thymos, which I actually would say the meaning crisis is one giant accident that unveils the need for Thymos, and the non-rational, because I would associate Thymos with the non-rational. All of these are unintended things that unveil that something is missing in their very accidents, that autonomous rationality cannot provide its own substance, because ultimately the substance of the human condition is a triadic structure. It is a beauty, true, and goodness. It is a Thymos, logos, and eros. You know, Alexander Bard will talk about mythos, logos, pathos, and different things. Like if anything, this is what I guess I'm getting at. I'll give it back to you. Everything autonomous, everything that tries to be singular, when the accident occurs, it is unveiled that it doesn't have substance, because nothing exists that is singular as such. And the very unveiling of that lack of substance is then evidence that what you need is a triadic structure, that there is something missing from that needs to be brought in. And so for me, game theory, so this is the thing, game theory to me the Nash equilibrium to me should actually point to the triadic structure. But instead, Logos, because it's so quick and it has really good sleight of hands, ends up convincing us that what we need is more rationality. It's like, COVID is like, well, if only people were more rational, if only Russia was more rational, if only the stock market was more rational, if only people were more rational, then everything would be solved. That's an example where a revelation of non-rationality is consumed so quickly by a feeling of rationality that then it convinces you that what you need is more calculation. Not more courage, more calculation. What you need is more Logos, not more Thymos. It's so quick and it's so hard to catch, which then, of course, how do you even know you need to be looking for that sleight of hand? Well, philosophical trait, like how do you even know you need to be looking for that? Well, Logos conceals that as well. So I think the nature of the crisis today, these sleight of hands, these Nash equilibrium, these having to engage in an act of taking armor off that is always irrational, but is actually non-rational, but socially can be understood as irrational. All of this points to the radical challenge of the world today.
Yeah, I like this idea of this mode of thought which is without substance as a crisis. I think that's a really good point about the kind of Virilio style interpretation of this substance of the crisis, of like reason without really a substance. It unveils itself as just kind of stupidity.
Yes.
And this also kind of feeds into this idea of like quantification is better. I mean, like more of something is just better.
Yeah.
Just because it's more, or less of something is better just because it's less. This kind of pure I think I was talking to Joshua Hansen. He mentioned something about metric fixation. I'm not sure if he coined that himself or got that from someone else, but it was this obsession with, and this kind of reminds me of this substanceless thought, this mere numbers. Like, we want to get to zero COVID. It's like, why? It's like, right. don't ask why. That's crazy and dangerous. We just have to get there. It's like, but why? And it's just like, I can't explain it. I just want to. It's merely for numbers. It's absolutely without substance. So I suppose it's also giving substance back to thought is difficult, and it's difficult when we have networks of rationality, because I think when one person is being rational, okay, that's fair enough, but then you have a network of rationality, and it seems to lead to what you were talking about with game theory, with this mass equilibrium. That's it. So you have this. I think one of the things that maybe one of the problems we have today, kind of relating to the idea of ourselves, and the pod is a theme of this, is like we're just kind of one unit. We're one unit, but we don't think about our connection to the other units. And when we might be reasonable, that may, and I think COVID in general, on both sides of the argument, actually, pro lockdown, anti-lockdown, brought up good points about this, about our kind of viral effect of like, yes, I may be doing something reasonable, but when I take into account me doing something reasonable within a network of other units, all of a sudden that's no longer reasonable, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of pretty much some of my thoughts on that. Yeah.
Well, that's actually, I can never say his name, but he's really brilliant. And he's another example of a forsaken thought thinker like Virilio, Gueron, Groyan. He talks about the tyranny of quantity over quality. And what he's saying is like the world today is all about quantity, like measuring quantity, but it doesn't ask questions of quality. Now, he is not saying that quantity is bad. Basically, all of the great thinkers end up saying something along the line, this is a very bold statement, but basically all of the great thinkers end up saying something along the line of, if it is autonomous, it is bad. If it is all there is like pure anything, autonomous anything is bad. If you have quantity without quality, it's bad. But if you have quality without quantity, that's bad too. And it's very, for me, that's Hegel, that's dialectical, that's kind of where the very failure, every entity entails within itself a destabilizing element that is realized precisely in its totalizing. Like everything entails a kind of contradiction. that blows it up. Like rationality, for Hegel, when you take rationality and you try to be really, really rational, eventually you find out that autonomous rationality is totalitarian, right? Like if you take beauty and you try to be really, really beautiful and nothing else, you find out that beauty becomes a force of control, propaganda, deception, stuff like that. So for Hegel, like every single concept, every single entity entails its own destabilizing element. And a lot of the great thinkers, and I'm actually increasingly convinced that people talk about the counter Enlightenment, like the Scottish Enlightenment, different thing. I actually think there was a modern counter Enlightenment that was completely missed, entailing people like a Virilio, like a Marcis Blondel, like a Feyerabend, like a Planier. There were a number of these thinkers. They're not postmodernists, but they're actually like a current alongside it that I think is really useful for helping us address this problem we've been describing of Nash equilibrium, armor, the loss of Thymos, but they were completely forsaken and missed because they were introducing a kind of dialectical thinking before Hegel's dialectic was interpreted in a manner of a perpetual destabilization versus an ultimate synthesis. Now, bringing in Hegel is always dangerous because there's 1,000 Hegels to 1,000 different people. And I think that's part of the very fact that Hegel himself makes himself unstable because form has to match message. And I think that contributes to, like, he constantly destabilizes himself throughout his own books. Different subject. Anyway, this modern counter-enlightenment, which is very based on action, which is very based on avoiding autonomous logic, which is very concerned about any sort of reducing quality to quantity, I think was entirely missed, which makes sense because Logos hates that crap. Rationality doesn't want anything to do with stuff that's going to talk about limits on rationality. Man, Benjamin Fontaine, get out. You're correct. We don't want to talk about Benjamin Fontaine. We don't want to talk about any of that stuff. And then do note, I think this is very important. There's this, well, come on, Daniel, wasn't Derrida and wasn't, a lot of the psychoanalytical thinkers critiquing rationality? I think it's very important to note that I would have to make this argument elsewhere. I think the postmodern critique of modernism is that it wasn't modern enough. It's not that modernism was bad, is that modernism didn't meet its own standards. And that's why it's in the wrong. Postmodernism does not say the standard was wrong. It basically says it's not possible to meet the standards. Okay, well, what is the alternative standard? I think postmodernism doesn't tend to posit one generally, because that risks the very totalitarianism it accuses modernism of. And then you get, metamodernism today. People will talk about metamodernism, which is the oscillation and all this. Metamodernism is another word that means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and I'm always very hesitant to use the term, but I do see metamodernism, funny enough, as, although it posits itself as kind of new, it actually, to me, points to this modern counter-enlightenment that I'm talking about. And it kind of seems to actually be the heritage or a kind of return. Anyway, what we do see today is, I think it's kind of funny because it's almost like what ends up happening is today, quantity is totalizing precisely to the point where precisely when it seems to have ultimate success and the entire world is forced to think in terms of quantity, that unveils its insufficiency. As for Hegel, it's at the point of completion that unveils the impossibility of completion. Likewise, what you're kind of seeing today is precisely because rationality is so powerful and so totalizing that people are starting to go, wait a minute. It at least seems like autonomous rationality is a problem, and it's unveiling its own destabilizing element. But this is the problem. If there's this kind of global destabilization that's occurring, are people ready to handle it? Are people ready to kind of deal with realizing that autonomous rationality doesn't work, realizing that we forgot quality? Well, we've been saying this whole time that people are born with armor on. We've been saying that they're not accessing Thymos or the power. So it's very concerning for me, because the accident we need to unveil that autonomous rationality is not going to work, to handle that accident and revelation requires a certain level of training and ability that precisely the arising to the situation has kept us from having. That to me seems like uniquely dire. Maybe not, but it seems like a really big problem, because arising to this point that's going to unleash this radical destabilization precisely has arisen because we have denied ourselves the thymos or the spiritedness or the courage to handle the unveiling of that situation. So that's like a really totalizing problem to me. And to me, that's what a Virilio, that's what a Fontaine, that's what these different people are pointing to. They're saying, hey guys, and then I'll give it back to you. Hey guys, we're arriving at a world that will create problems that are a result of not gaining the abilities to handle those very problems. So it's like it's like the very act of weakening yourself is creating the problem that you will need strength to face, that by definition you won't have to face because the problem arose due to that very weakening. That is very unique, which doesn't seem like that was possible in the past, where crisis had to be objective, like crops or barbarians. Like literally your weakening is not going to cause barbarians to invade. Your thymatic weakening is not going to cause the plants to rot. You see what I'm saying? But today, the very loss of spiritedness is what leads to the emergent result of a crisis that only can happen due to the loss of that spiritedness, of which then needs that spiritedness to address. And that is, to me, your work points to that kind of totalizing problem, that uniquely totalizing and kind of terrifying problem. And maybe I'm being a little dramatic and kind of almost pointing to a Gerardian apocalypse or something like that. But to me, that's why this problem is so concerning, because it has arisen precisely in the act that removed the resources we needed to handle the problem. And that seems uniquely dire.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point you made about the person at the gates and the barbarians are there, the difference between them and us, because I think that, and this is a kind of point I was listening to, I've been reading James Simpkins' blog recently about
I love that guy.
Fantastic blog. And he had an interview, I haven't finished all of it today, with some people, I can't remember their names, but they were talking about the information networks as a part of war. And I think when you're talking about these kind of we're talking about a network of people that are sort of so interlinked. So if you have one weak component in a link, it's kind of disastrous compared to back in the day where you might have had like kind of an elite class of protectors who were going to protect you from the barbarians.
Right
now, because we're in this kind of emotionally synchronized, to use Paul Virilio's terms, emotionally synchronized kind of network of reality. And what's at stake isn't just the barbarians getting us or not getting us, and we can simply build a bigger wall, is the very ability to perceive if the barbarians are real or not.
Yes.
I think that ability to perceive what is real requires certain virtues and requires certain strengths that we were all talking about. Discipline, it requires delaying gratification, it requires disciplined thought. It also requires, I think, kind of social cooperation and a kind of learned ability to have discourse and discuss and disagree in ways which isn't just, throwing something at somebody and so on. So at least if you're not at war with each other, I mean, if you're in the same side, I mean, you're obviously not going to have rational discussion with someone you're at war with, but if you're on the same side, but when you have these networks and everything becomes engulfed in war, the information technologies become engulfed in war, and you have these crises that are very much based around, if you think about like a kind of shield wall of people, to use our armor analogy, a shield wall only works because everyone agrees that they're going to stick in this unit and not just going to go, I'm just going to run away because I don't like this, So the shield wall only works with a kind of cooperative discipline. And I think that what you're seeing is like our kind of information networks, which build up a reality, and we're trying to decipher what's real or not. And there's these information is distance, and distance is therefore armor. You're seeing basically people just constantly breaking from the shield wall and running every direction you want.
Absolutely.
because they're just bombarded with too much information, they're bombarded with too much emotion, they're bombarded with too much stimulation of the wrong kind, I think, to the point where you're going to have these networks of fear and of crises and desire and so on that are kind of breaking down our ability to, I think, cooperate in a way in which we can decipher whether or not are the barbarians here because they just want some flour or some I don't know, or are they here because they want to kill us all? We don't really know if they're even there or not. We don't know what's real. So yeah.
I really like this point you're making on how distance contributes to our inability to be in formation, which is needed for defense and offense. I really like Daniel Fraga, his book Ontological Design kind of talks about how today you're always already in a kind of battle to design you, to control you with the algorithms and the technology and ontological design. And it's very interesting to think that without the ability to think of ontological design not just as an individual duel, But in order to actually succeed in not being ontologically designed by the corporations or governments or whatever, you need a formation, like a military formation with other people. But the very existence of the network makes that very difficult to do. That's a really good formulation. And yes, indeed, Mr. Dr. James Simkin is outstanding. Everyone said micro liberations, the bond, just, I love him. I really like also where you brought up virtue. And I think virtue, that's really helpful. Because like you said, it's like you require the virtues to see the crisis. And yet those virtues are also what you need to address the crisis. So if you're not forming those virtues anymore, you don't have the ability to see the crisis as a crisis, and you don't even have the ability to address the crisis. You know, that kind of that totalizing problem where you have to have the virtues to address the crisis to even know it's a crisis is a very unique structure that is terrible. You know, it's really a problem, because how do you convince people that something is a crisis if they don't have the virtues to see it as a crisis? Because following their rationality, it is not. Right? Following their rationality is not a crisis. So you're literally the madman in the square, right? You're the prophet. It makes it, the only parallel I can think about that is kind of in religion, and I just use Christianity because that's an easy reference. You know, you have these weird lines in Christianity where Jesus says stuff like, if I would have never come, you wouldn't have known that you broke the law, you know, where you have to believe in Jesus to even know you're a sinner. And if you don't even know you're a sinner, let alone know you're not a sinner. There's this weird way in which, like in salvation in Christianity, which is the beginning of sanctification, it's not the whole, there's more to do. Like, you have to accept the premise of Christianity to even know you need Christianity. There's this weird totalizing that's going on, where you have to accept the premise that sin exists to even know you need to be saved from it, right? So you have to take the whole package or you don't get any of it. It's really weird. That's where you get this history and Christian thought of like election. And well, if it's so weird that only the Holy Spirit can do it, like there's no way to explain it. It's never rational because you have to take the whole picture. And you get this whole debate in Christianity on the role of providence and different things like that. Something similar seems to be happening here, where the very ability to see the thing as a crisis requires the virtues to solve the crisis. Because the point is, like, if you believe in Christianity, of which tells you a sinner, that means you also believe in the way to avoid that sin. Like the very belief in the problem that you are saved from comes in the very act of assenting to the problem. You see what I'm saying? Like you're not going to believe, say, in sin and then not also believe in the solution to that sin. It comes together, you see, in Christianity. It's very hard to see someone saying, I'm a Christian and I believe, you know, but I don't believe in Jesus. That doesn't really make sense, right? Like if you believe in the existence of sin, you also believe in the solution of it. So likewise, what's so weird is it's almost like the problem today has a similar structure, where the very act of saying this is a crisis also necessitates the acceptance of the solution to that crisis, of which unveils that crisis. So it's like a whole thing. You got to take the whole or you don't get any of it. Which then, if we go to this kind of theological debate, might suggest the necessity of accident. Like in Christianity, there's basically two ways you realize your need for the Holy Spirit: beauty or devastation. Like you see like a mystical experience that makes you go, oh my gosh, God must exist, or your life falls apart and you realize that you have nothing. And so it's devastation or wonder, basically, or what take it to you. Well, it might be the case that the only way to get the world to understand this very problem is a global devastation, like a global disaster, or some experience of beauty. And that would wake people up and go, what did we do wrong? Which would suggest, unfortunately, the necessity of something like World War III, or something like, because unfortunately, obviously, COVID was too abstract to wake people up. You know, it's not objective enough. It's not enough like it's not enough like your crops dying. It's not enough like a barbarian because it's kind of invisible, right? Well, missiles going off or an earthquake or something horrible might be objective enough to make the whole package of the crisis become clear. But then, of course, this is what I think about. It would seem to be the case of if something like that occurred, it would be apocalyptic, right? Like literally, if let's say you could say, well, what if there was an economic downturn? I'm of the opinion that there's currently a global debt bubble, which is like the Cold War never ended, it just turned to debt, and there's like a mutually assured destruction. Like the dollar's so big that if it goes down, everything goes down with it. So you can't have an like, why is the dollar getting strong right now? It makes literally no sense. because the dollar basically calls it that? Well, because it's the safest bet in town. So literally after 2008, the dollar benefited. Like right now, the dollar is benefiting from the financial crisis. Makes no sense at all unless the bond market is structured according to mutually assured destruction. So the point is, if you need an economic downturn to wake everyone up, the conditions are not there to allow the economic downturn that would make people realize what's going on, that there's this crisis and the solution. You say, well, what if we had a war? If you had a serious war, we're probably all dead. There's like a nuclear apocalypse. Now I know, now maybe it's drones. Do you really want drones? That seems like, I'm not sure actually if a drone wasteland is better or worse than a nuclear apocalypse. Like the psychological devastation of knowing there are drones everywhere, is that really better? I'm not so sure. So arguably the severity, this is what I'm getting at. If it is the case that you need devastation, say in Christian theology, to realize you're a sinner and that you need Jesus. And there's something similar today with the problem we're talking about, where you need a crisis to realize that you've not been living according to a triadic spirit, that there's a crisis there that exists precisely because you lack the virtues to address that crisis. If you need a devastation to realize that very schema, but the devastation cannot occur without being apocalyptic, that sounds like a checkmate situation. That sounds like a really, really checkmatey situation, I hate to say, which then and then I guess I'll say, for me, that means the only alternative is like beauty, right? Because that's the other conception in Christianity, like wonder and beauty, or something to wake you up to something higher. And of course, we can talk about decentralization. I think that's a lot of like decentralization where you can have devastation, it doesn't take down the whole system. And then that gets me interested in all of the Web 3.0. And that's a whole different subject, but it is curious. I can't say I'm an expert on it. But the other alternative is something like wonder and beauty. And that's where like an OG Rose, all this leads to like the fate of beauty is the fate of us. Aesthetics, beauty, the ability to aesthetically comprehend, which gets into intrinsic motivation. But to me, it does seem as if it's not possible for us to somehow have a aesthetic awakening to this totalizing problem, this kind of all-consuming problem that we're describing, it might be checkmate, because the only other way would be a devastation that now would be too dire to occur and not bring the whole thing down. So that's pretty grim, but it does seem like something like that might be going on.
Yeah, I think as you're saying, the kind of crisis reveals the problem in a sense, but we seem to have mechanisms to not necessarily mitigate the crisis, but to mitigate the revelation.
Yes.
Like that's basically what our systems do today. So you have this kind of perpetual crisis, and it's going to fit into the theme of the end of history. And you don't really have a full overcoming of the end of history, but you don't really have the end of history as it was originally foretold. You have this kind of perpetual ending. I think Zizek's brought this point up before. You have this kind of ending, it's kind of continuous, constant ending. It doesn't really ever, the ending itself doesn't end. And I think this is partly, a problem with you were saying like the sin presupposes the salvation. I think the problem presupposes the solution, and an evil monster presupposes a hero.
Oh,
and I think
that was so good in your book where you talked about the monster stuff. That was really good.
Yeah. So I think, and like that was kind of I thought was to fit it into the topic of kind of this, being born with armor and then not having armor. The monster, and I mean, this kind of goes into the kind of talk about nature and what is nature. And I think today we have this kind of view of nature maybe sometimes is a bit like romantic and harmonious. And I think nature is pretty indifferent and cold and in a way, but this indifference and harshness and coldness presupposes a sort of overcoming, a heroic overcoming, right? So there's beauty in nature, but not necessarily in nature without us. There's beauty in nature, in our dynamic with nature. There's beauty. But this isn't just a technological, I don't think, overcoming. I think this has to be a more nuanced overcoming. But I suppose the main point was that the salvation solution hero part seems to be barred, I think, somehow.
Yes.
It's barred. And I think that, just talking about the theme of perpetual crises and what's going on, I think that it's not so much a solution of averting crisis. I think the crisis is here. I think it's more the solution of like, can we avert the constant barring of the solution, of the revelation. I think that's the real crisis. It's not the actual crisis, because these crises were just in the works for a long time and they're kind of inevitable in some sense. But the crisis of revelation, I think, is perhaps the better way to frame crisis.
I think that's really well put. You know, a way to put it, who's the horror writer that did the Ancient Ones, the beings? Oh my gosh.
H.P. Lovecraft?
Yes, well, a Lovecraft. Very good. Yeah. I was really feeling like, wow, I really have not had enough coffee if I can't remember Lovecraft. So like, you know, so the Ancient Ones in Lovecrafts are basically beings that if you encounter, you're done for. Like you're reduced to ash. They're like gods that are like just overwhelming, and they're weird and crazy and different things. So this is what I wonder. You do a very good job, and you like the loss of monsters is kind of a bad thing, right? Like if there's no monsters, there's a bad thing. So it's almost like today, we've created a situation where the only monsters we can encounter are Ancient Ones from Lovecraft. So it's like barred in the very severity of the monster. And if we require monsters collectively for the collective to accept the non-rational truth of the triadic soul, and without a triadic soul, you end up in Nash equilibriums, meaning crisis, you know, all of this stuff. We have a problem, because the only thing that would collectively wake people up to that triadic soul and escape phenomenological ignorance, as you said, in order to truly escape phenomenological ignorance, you need an encounter with a monster, we could say, using your book, or a devastation, or beauty. You see, it seems to be like beauty or monster, you could say. And, you know, beauty is the opposite of a monster if we think of it like an angel or a seraphim. And then it's really interesting how the angels in the Bible are actually kind of monsters. We forget this. We have a conception of angels now that is very cute, and it's like seraphim and different things. Man, they're like wheels and wheels, and they got multiple head animals. Like angels in the Bible and the Torah are like crazy looking. Like they're kind of like monsters, and yet they're not monsters in a Lovecraft way. They're kind of monsters in a good way. It's very interesting, but we forget how weird seraphim look. We forget how weird angels look. Anyway, so monsters and beauty, in that, if we're thinking in that realm, like seraphim, are very similar. But the Lovecraft monster reduces you to ash, right? Where the seraphim kind of points you to, hey, you're a sinner, you need God, you know, you need to get your act together. Okay. What if today it's no longer possible to encounter seraphim? It's only possible to encounter Ancient Ones from Lovecraft. And yet it is only possible to collectively wake up to the triadic soul, the need for a triadic soul, if you encounter a monster. Like you're saying, it seems like we're barred from the experience we need from the awakening. Now, I hate to be one of those, you know, it's very difficult to find philosophers who are not apocalyptic. I don't want to be sounding that way, because just when you think the world's going to end, you know, it beats the Nazis or whatever. But there is something interesting going on where you have new mechanisms of abstraction that are barring experiences from seraphim, which the very mechanisms of that barring makes it to where the only monsters you can encounter are Ancient Ones from Lovecraft, of which humans cannot encounter because it reduces you to ash. You don't get a triadic soul from that. You're just reduced to ash. You know, it's too much. Well, that's a problem. And if that's what's going on, how do we overcome that problem? What does it mean to overcome that problem? I think it's extremely severe.
Yeah, I think if you think of crisis as a sort of monster, or like a monster being a sort of an analogy or metaphor for crisis, I think like, just to bring up accelerationism, my problem with accelerationism, the accelerationism presupposes that with the crisis, with the monster, with the sin, is the salvation and the hero. And I don't think that I think that as I said before, our problem today is more complicated than that. It's not so much that there's no crisis to motivate the hero. There's plenty of things today to motivate the hero, but there's, as we were saying, this very motivation itself, this very encounter, has somehow been distorted to the point where the heroic spirit, or the innovative solution, or however we want to put it, has sort of like almost gone extinct. Right. So this is the kind of post-historical theme, I suppose, coming back into play.
Absolutely. And again, there's a way, I guess, for me in my head, I almost think of a crisis as a centralized monster. Whereas like, you know, it's almost like you had decentralized monster, whether it be the lion, it's like not one big monster everyone faces in the network, but it's like decentralized. And it was almost good when monsters were decentralized and spread up, because then you could encounter it, or someone could fail over here and you could fail over there and you could succeed. Where it's not like one success or one failure determines the whole board, right? And so there is this way now in which also too, absolutely, there are still opportunities in the life for a given individual to say, face a monster, or to answer Thymos, or develop the triadic. So the problem is on the collective, because of these total depravity, game theory dynamics of logos, it seems like it's very difficult for the collective. And in order to get a collective to kind of wake up to this triadic soul, which seems necessary if you're in a democratic, you know, a global democracy, basically a democratic republic democracy, or capitalism, which is very much a reflection of a collective. Like, so what the collective does is very important. And if the collective is not going to awaken, because if the majority of people are not going to wake up to the triadic soul, because they must in their individual life make choices that are quote unquote non-rational. And therefore the collective will be a reflection of rationality. Almost by definition, the collective has to be a reflection of rationality. Unfortunately, what is rational is not always right. That's a big mistake of capitalism, in my opinion. Like it argues, you know, the market is always rational. Well, yeah, but rationality is not always right. You know, you're conflating rational and right. Yes, the market tends to reflect what it believes is rational, but it is not the case that what is rational is always what is best. But the mistake is what game theory behavioral stuff shows is that, yes, like pleasure is rational. Right? Pleasure is rational. That's the problem. Like saying the market is always rational doesn't really tell you anything, because what is it that it is defining as rational? And that's not a rational act. The definition of the values of rationality are non-rational, right? Okay, so the collective is going to reflect rationality, and that rationality is going to probably reflect autonomous rationality, which is going to be this effacing structure, okay? Well, in order to get the collective to wake up out of that, from its dogmatic slumber, if it wills, you would need a collective crisis. But if the crisis today can only be the ancient one out of Lovecraft, that is very dire. And then the question would be, how do you avoid that? And that's the $1 million one that I think about all the time. That your work certainly helps with. I fear, Raymond, I have to go watch the kids. I'm so sorry. I hope we can do this again. I want to say that your book so clearly, for me, provides resource to even think this problem, to kind of get at it, to see it, that it's invaluable, that it's extremely important. Note from a pod, it ties well. I couldn't help but hint at studies in Thymos. I think it's a tremendous book. Your channel is tremendous. So I'm just extremely grateful for your work, Raymond. And Owen, Raymond, you know, I'm just extremely grateful for everything that you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me on. That was, I suppose, more or less the point of the book, was really just because it's a short book, it's only like 55 pages. So it's really just a kind of service level, like breaking into these problems. And then hopefully people who read them can sort of think in more detail and go into one component in kind of more depth and so on. So that's really the kind of purpose, just to kind of break open that surface and jump right into these things.
Well, if you don't know where you are, you have no idea where you might go or could go. Sure. And so that's invaluable. I think that's completely invaluable. And I think the classical resources that can help us figure out where we are and why we got here are not often tapped into. You know, people don't tend to read Latches. They tend to read the classical works that are talked about, but certainly they don't read Achilles or the Iliad in the manners that you're bringing forth. That's our necessary resources to get a sense of what's going on. And for that, I greatly appreciate what you do. I'd love to talk to you again, Raymond. So thank you so much for your time. This has been a joy.
Thank you.